The year is 4412 by the Galactic Standard Calendar, which, by the way, humans never agreed to use, but that is a separate tragedy entirely. The Vaelthari conclave had existed for 11,000 years. 11,000 years of carefully maintained peace, meticulously negotiated borders, and a collective agreement that certain species were simply too unpredictable to be included in polite galactic society. The conclave had expelled members before. The Dreth Collective after the Sigma incident, the Murai Hive after that business with the neutron irrigation project that nobody talks about anymore. But those expulsions were quiet, bureaucratic. The offending species signed the documents, accepted the exclusion zones, and retreated to their corners of the universe to sulk appropriately. Humanity's expulsion was different. Humanity's expulsion was, and I say this as someone who witnessed it firsthand from the diplomatic observation deck of the Vaelthari flagship Eternal Consensus, the single most baffling sequence of events in the recorded history of 14 civilizations. Let me explain how we got here. My name is Verath Solaan, Senior Observation Analyst for the Conclave Bureau of Xenological Affairs. My job, for the past 60 years, has been to watch humans, study them, write reports about them that my superiors read with increasing expressions of existential discomfort. I have 312 filed reports. The first 200 concerned mostly minor incidents, humans negotiating aggressively, humans refusing to honor established resource divisions, humans doing that thing they do where they smile while saying something that is technically not a threat but absolutely is a threat. Standard stuff. Reports 313 onward, well, those are sealed. For the psychological well-being of conclave staff, the expulsion order was passed on a Tuesday. Humans had invented Tuesday, incidentally, and forced its adoption onto 3 neighboring systems through sheer cultural contamination. The conclave voted. The margin was enormous. Species representing 47 worlds agreed that humanity, their 3 inhabited systems, their 11 colonial stations, their frankly unreasonable number of deep space vessels, would be formally removed from conclave membership, stripped of galactic trade access, and confined to a quarantine corridor that effectively boxed them into a dead-end stretch of space, with limited resources and no political allies. The vote was presented to the human delegation at 0900 hours Galactic Standard Time. The human ambassador was a woman named Petra Voss, short, gray-haired, with the kind of eyes that made you feel like she was already 3 moves ahead of whatever you were doing. She read the expulsion order. She set it down. She looked at High Chancellor Uran, who had spent 6 months crafting this moment to be as definitive and humiliating as possible. She looked at the assembled delegates. She looked back at Chancellor Uran. Then she said, okay. Chancellor Uran had prepared a speech. He had practiced it. It was devastating. It referenced humanity's failure to comply with 37 separate conclave directives, their destabilization of the Oran trade routes, the incident at Callaway Station that we still cannot fully explain, and their general attitude problem, which was real and well documented. The speech was going to last 40 minutes and end with a formal censure that would be broadcast on the conclave's diplomatic frequency to every member world. Petra Voss said okay and started gathering her things. Ambassador, Uran said, somewhat thrown. You do understand the scope of this? Yep, she said. The quarantine corridor will restrict your access to, we saw the maps. She snapped her briefcase shut. Humans still used briefcases, which I have always found endearing and slightly alarming. And stood. Is there paperwork? There was a great deal of paperwork. She signed all of it, quickly, without reading it, which made 3 of the conclave's legal observers physically ill. Then she shook Chancellor Uran's hand. Humans do this. They grab your appendage and move it up and down as a greeting, and no amount of diplomatic training fully prepares you for it. And she walked out. The broadcast of humanity's formal expulsion went out on schedule. It was by every metric a complete success. The conclave had spoken. The quarantine was established. 47 species breathed something equivalent to a collective sigh of relief. The relief lasted approximately 8 months. I am not, by nature, an anxious creature. My species, the Vaelthari, have a lifespan of roughly 400 years, and we tend toward a long view of events. But I will tell you sincerely that when the first report came in from the quarantine corridor monitoring stations, 8 months after the expulsion, filed by a surveillance drone operator named Quoth, who I later learned had to take extended medical leave after submitting it, I felt something in my chest that my physician would later describe as stress-induced thoracic compression. Quoth's report was short. 3 sentences, actually. I have memorized them. Monitoring Station 7 has detected large-scale construction activity at coordinates 44 to Bravo 9 within the quarantine corridor. Activity does not match any registered human industrial template, requesting clarification on what humans are building, as it appears to be very large and pointing outward. Now, the quarantine corridor, for those unfamiliar with the geography, was designed very specifically to have only one viable exit, back into human space. The boundaries were set against a dense nebular region on 3 sides, the kind that scrambles navigation and shreds hulls, and the 4th side was monitored by a conclave patrol fleet under Admiral Austin Drell, who had 60 warships and a mandate to ensure nothing came through. The whole architecture of the quarantine was predicated on one assumption, that the nebular region was impassable. Humans had apparently disagreed with this assumption and decided to build something about it. I requested the full sensor package from Monitoring Station 7 and spent 2 days reviewing it with my colleague Faran Chu, a Mendivar analyst who had worked the human desk even longer than I had, and who had developed a facial tic around the left eye stalk that appeared specifically when humans did things like this. By the end of the sensor review, the tic was doing something I can only describe as a full performance. What humans had built, in 8 months, with the resources of 3 systems and 11 stations, inside a quarantine that was supposed to demoralize them into submission, was a transit apparatus, a massive one. It was anchored to a rogue planetoid near the nebular boundary, and it was, as Quoth had so helpfully noted, pointing outward, specifically into the densest part of the nebular region where navigation was considered not just difficult, but physically incoherent. We sent a formal query to the Human Colonial Authority, Standard Protocol. The response came back from a man named Deo Okafor, Deputy Director of Human Expansion Affairs, a title that, I noted with some alarm, had not existed in any human governmental directory 8 months ago. The response read, "Thank you for your inquiry. The apparatus you have detected is a prototype resonance lane generator. We expect initial trials within 60 days. Please update your navigation charts as the northeastern nebular passage will become active transit space. Regards, Dio Okafor, Deputy Director, HEA. P.S. If you have concerns about this, you are welcome to raise them with Ambassador Voss." I raised them with Ambassador Voss. She was in the quarantine corridor, technically, because that was where humans were now officially located. But she had come to a conclave-adjacent station for what she described as a courtesy meeting. I use the word courtesy loosely because nothing about Petra Voss had ever struck me as particularly courteous. She was sitting across from me in a small conference room, drinking coffee, which humans do constantly, and which smells like burned ambition. "You're building a road," I said. "Yes," she said, "through the impassable nebula." "Well, it was impassable." She sipped her coffee. "We're working on that." I looked at her for a long moment. "Ambassador, the conclave expelled you. The intent was—" "I know what the intent was," she said. She was not angry. That was the unsettling part. She was calm and slightly amused, the way a person is calm and amused when they have already figured out the end of a story you are still trying to narrate. "You wanted us contained. You wanted us to feel the weight of it, sit quietly, maybe come back in a few centuries with better manners." She set down her cup. "We didn't really have a few centuries to spare." "Why not?" She smiled. It was a very particular smile. I have since seen it on several other humans. A kind of warm, unconcerned expression that somehow manages to also be deeply ominous. "Because there's a lot of space out there," she said. "And it doesn't care about conclave borders." I filed Report 313 that afternoon. The Resonance Lane trial happened on day 58, 2 days ahead of schedule, because humans apparently cannot help themselves. We had 17 monitoring drones positioned along the nebular boundary, Admiral Drell's patrol fleet on full alert, and approximately 900 conclave officials watching on live sensor feeds from the comfort of their offices, because nobody wanted to be physically close to whatever was about to happen. The apparatus activated at 0600 hours. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. The nebular region did what it always did. Churned and crackled and made instruments behave like frightened children. Then something happened. A corridor opened. That is the only way I can describe it. The nebular interference didn't disappear. Exactly, it moved. Like something had reached into the chaos of the region and carefully, firmly pushed it aside. A clean passage, roughly 4 kilometers wide and extending as far as our sensors could read, punched straight through what had been considered an astronomical absolute. The monitoring drones went quiet for 3 seconds. Later analysis suggested they were experiencing sensor recalibration, and then they started screaming data. The first human ship through the passage was a survey vessel called the Persistent Margot. I mention the name because I think it is the most human name for a ship that I have ever encountered. It came through the passage at standard transit speed, running lights on, broadcasting a navigation beacon on the open frequency. Its hull markings showed it was part of the newly constituted Human Expansion Authority, HEA. That office, I later learned, had been created the same day as the expulsion order was signed. Petra Voss had not said okay because she was accepting defeat. She had said okay because she was done. Done with negotiations, done with directives, done with 47 species voting on what humans were and were not allowed to do. She had walked out of that room, signed those papers, and before her shuttle had cleared conclave space, she had already made 2 calls. One to Deo Okafor, who became Deputy Director of Human Expansion Affairs that afternoon, and one to a physicist named Imara Solis, who had been working on the resonance lane theory for 6 years and had been told by 3 separate conclave science committees that it was, and I am quoting the formal rejection, theoretically irresponsible. Imara Solis, it turned out, was theoretically irresponsible in the most spectacular way possible. The Persistent Margot transmitted a short message on the open frequency as it cleared the nebular passage. It was addressed to the Vaelthari conclave, to all 47 member species, to Admiral Drell's patrol fleet watching from their side of a border that had just become functionally meaningless, and to me specifically. I still do not fully understand how Petra Voss knew I would be watching, but she did, because she always did. The message said, "Passage confirmed. Transit nominal. Proceeding to survey new space. We'll send a postcard." And then the Persistent Margot accelerated and disappeared into the dark beyond the nebula, into space that no conclave chart had ever mapped, that no conclave vessel had ever touched, that 11,000 years of careful galactic civilization had collectively agreed was someone else's problem. Behind it, 14 more ships were already forming up at the passage entrance. I sat very still in the monitoring center for a while after that. Farin Chu's eye stalk tick had stopped entirely. I think it had simply given up. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when everyone in it realizes, simultaneously, that they have made a catastrophic miscalculation. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the silence of 47 species worth of diplomats, analysts, and admirals staring at sensor feeds showing 15 human ships filing through an impossible passage like they were merging onto a highway, and nobody having a single useful thing to say about it. Admiral Ossen Drell broke the silence first. He sent a formal communication to Conclave High Command that read in its entirety, "The quarantine is no longer structurally viable, requesting new orders." He was a precise man. Admiral Drill. I respected that about him. He did not panic. He simply identified that the architecture of the situation had changed and asked someone above his pay grade to figure out what to do about it. High Command's response took 11 hours. 11 hours during which the Human Expansion Authority sent 31 ships through the nebular passage. I counted. The formal conclave response, when it finally came, was a masterwork of institutional denial. It declared that humanity's transit apparatus constituted a violation of the expulsion agreement, which it did not, technically, because nobody had thought to include a clause about building roads through impassable nebulae. Because why would you? And demanded that all HEA vessels return to the quarantine corridor immediately pending review. The response from Dio Okafor arrived within the hour. It was polite. It was extremely polite, in the way that a locked door is polite. It does not argue with you. It simply does not open. He thanked the conclave for its communication, noted that HEA vessels were operating in uncharted space outside any established jurisdiction, and wished the conclave a productive review process. Then he attached a navigational update. 43 new star systems, preliminarily catalogued, 17 showing signs of resource potential, 3 flagged for further investigation due to, and I am reading directly from the attachment here, anomalous readings consistent with prior technological presence. They had been out there for 11 hours, and they had already found ruins. I called Petra Voss again. She was on a ship by then, the HEA administrative vessel Rena Falk, which was apparently the floating headquarters of whatever humanity was currently doing to the galaxy. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been awake for 3 days doing something enormous and are running on determination and caffeinated beverages. There was noise in the background. A lot of it. People talking, equipment cycling, someone somewhere laughing very loudly at something. Verath, she said. She used my name. Humans do this constantly. Use your name in conversation as if it is punctuation. I had found it presumptuous for years. Somewhere around Report 280 I had started finding it oddly affecting instead. What can I do for you? You could stop, I said. She looked at me for a moment. No, she said. The conclave will deliberate, she said. It will form committees. It will draft strongly worded documents. Verath, I have been receiving strongly worded documents from the conclave for 30 years. I have a drawer full of them. I use them to prop up a slightly short desk leg. She leaned closer to the screen. You know what the space beyond that nebula has. No committees, no deliberation, no 11,000 years of everyone agreeing to want less, so nobody is uncomfortable. She paused. We're going to go find out what's out there. And if something out there objects, I asked, that particular smile again. Then we'll deal with it, she said. She ended the call. I sat with that for a long time. The anomalous ruins, as it turned out, were not ruins in the conventional sense. The 3 flagged systems contained structures, enormous ones, distributed across multiple planets and orbital positions that preliminary analysis dated to approximately 200,000 years ago. Whatever had built them was gone. Had been gone for so long that the concept of gone had started to feel inadequate. The structures were massive, silent, and completely intact, which was itself a deeply unsettling data point, because 200,000 years of cosmic radiation and micro-impact should have reduced them to dust, and they were not dust. They were simply there, waiting, in the specific way that things wait when they were built to wait indefinitely. EA's chief archaeologist was a man named Tomas Ferreira, who had previously spent 20 years studying pre-conclave ruins in the outer systems, and who had, by all accounts, been extremely frustrated by the conclave's strict regulations on archaeological access. Those regulations no longer applied to him. I watched his first recorded transmission from the primary structure site, and I will say, without exaggeration, that I have never seen a human being that happy. He was practically vibrating. He kept touching the wall of the structure with one hand and talking very fast about mineral composition and energy signatures and something he called deliberate geometry that I did not fully understand but which made him use the word extraordinary approximately 17 times in 4 minutes. What Tomas Ferreira found over the following weeks was a map, not a literal map, though there were those too eventually. What he found, encoded in the geometry of the structures themselves, was a record, a catalog. The builders, humanity started calling them the precursors, because humans love a dramatic name, had spent what appeared to be several thousand years of their civilization documenting everything they had found in the galaxy, every inhabited system, every intelligent species, every resource deposit, every anomaly, every location of interest across a survey range that covered roughly a third of the known galaxy, and a significant portion of what the Conclave had always considered unknown. The Conclave had been charting space for 11,000 years. The precursors had been doing it for 190,000 years before that. Humanity had stumbled directly into the most comprehensive navigational and xenological database in galactic history, 8 months after being expelled to a dead-end corridor, because they were constitutionally incapable of sitting still. I included this in Report 317. My supervisor read it and immediately took the rest of the day off. The political implications took approximately 3 weeks to fully metastasize through Conclave member worlds. There were emergency sessions. There were extraordinary emergency sessions. There were sessions so emergency that they had to create new procedural classifications for them. Chancellor Uran aged visibly during this period. I saw him twice on broadcast feeds, and each time he looked like a man who had been told the punchline of a joke he had not realized he was sitting inside. The core problem, stripped of all diplomatic language, was this. Humanity now had access to something the Conclave did not. Something enormously valuable. Something that changed the navigational and strategic calculus of galactic civilization in ways that were still being calculated and would continue to be calculated for years. And humanity was not inside the Conclave anymore. They were not subject to its sharing agreements, its resource protocols, its careful systems of collective access and mutual obligation. They were outside, in their own space, in possession of a 200,000-year-old treasure that nobody else could reach without going through a nebular passage that only their technology could open. Petra Voss received the first formal Conclave request for renewed dialogue on a Wednesday. She waited 4 days before responding. When she did respond, it was not with Petra Voss, it was with Dio Okafor, which was, I thought, an exquisitely calibrated choice. He was courteous. He was thorough. He outlined the HEA's position with the kind of clean, organized clarity that suggested someone had spent considerable time thinking about exactly what they wanted and exactly how to ask for it. What humanity wanted was renegotiation, not reinstatement. They were quite clear on that. Not membership in the Conclave on the Conclave's terms. What they wanted was a new framework. One that acknowledged that the political geography of the last 11,000 years had changed. One that treated humanity not as a difficult junior species to be managed, but as a separate power with its own space, its own access, its own agenda, and, this part was new, its own database of precursor knowledge that it was willing to share under appropriate conditions. The appropriate conditions were detailed across 14 pages. I read them 3 times. They were fair in the way that terms presented by someone holding considerably more leverage than they held last year are fair, which is to say, they were fair and also completely non-negotiable, and everyone involved understood both things simultaneously. Chancellor Uran requested a direct conversation with Ambassador Voss. She agreed because she could afford to agree to anything at this point. I was not in the room for that conversation. I reviewed the transcript afterward. Uran had prepared another speech, shorter this time, more conciliatory, the kind of speech that is trying to be gracious about something that is killing the speaker to be gracious about. He talked about the Conclave's long history, its stability, its achievements, the genuine value of the structure humanity was now operating outside of. Petra Voss listened. She was, by all transcript accounts, attentive and respectful. When he finished, she said, "High Chancellor, with the greatest respect, we didn't leave, You pushed us out. We just decided to land somewhere interesting. Yuran was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had this planned," she said. "We had contingencies," he said. "The expansion office. You created it before you left the building," she said. "We created it before the vote." Another silence. Longer this time. "How long?" Yuran asked. Petra Voss smiled. The smile, I imagine, I was not there to see it, but I know that smile well enough by now to reconstruct it precisely. "Hi, Chancellor," she said. "We've had a drawer full of strongly worded documents for 30 years. Did you think we weren't reading them?" The new framework was signed 6 months later. It was called the Peripheral Accord, which was technically neutral language but which everyone understood as a very specific kind of joke, because humanity was no longer the peripheral party. Under the accord, the HEA operated as an independent entity with observer status at the conclave, mutual non-interference protocols, and a structured data-sharing arrangement for precursor knowledge that was, by conservative estimates, going to reshape galactic navigation, archaeology, and resource science for the next several centuries. Tomás Ferreira, by the time the accord was signed, had catalogued 11 inhabited precursor sites, and was working on what he described in his reports as the main one, which was an orbital installation of such scale that HEA survey teams had initially mistaken it for a moon. He sent updates weekly. The updates consistently used the word extraordinary. I had started to think he might not know other words, but then he sent a transmission from inside the installation's central processing architecture, which was active, had apparently always been active, had been running on some form of energy source that conclave physics did not have a satisfying name for, and the word he used was not extraordinary. The word he used was hello. I read that report, and I sat very still for quite a long time. The precursor installation had registered the presence of human researchers and responded. Not in any language anyone recognized. Not in any communication format catalogued across 11,000 years of conclave xenological records, in a format that Tomás Ferreira's team spent 3 weeks decoding, and which turned out to be, at its most basic level, a greeting, a handshake, an acknowledgement, a system that had been asleep for 200,000 years waking up because something had finally come and knocked on the right door. Humanity had knocked on the door. Of course they had. You exile them to a corner of the galaxy, they build a road through the impassable dark, find the 200,000-year-old archive, and then accidentally wake up whatever the previous occupants left running on the lights. This is what they do. This is specifically, characteristically, infuriatingly what they do. I filed report 322 that evening. It was the longest report I had ever written. In the conclusion I noted, in the dry, analytical language appropriate to a Bureau of Xenological Affairs document, that the Vaelthari conclave's expulsion of humanity had produced, net, the following outcomes: the opening of new transit corridors through previously impassable space, the discovery of the most significant archaeological sites in recorded galactic history, a fundamental restructuring of the political relationship between humanity and the conclave, on terms substantially more favorable to humanity, and first contact with a 200,000-year-old intelligence that had apparently been waiting for someone to show up and was, as best as anyone could currently determine, pleased with who had arrived. The expulsion had taken 6 months to plan. It had been designed to diminish humanity, to contain them, to send a message about their place in the galactic order. They had received the message. They had filed it next to 30 years of other messages in a drawer under a slightly short desk leg. And then they had built a road into the dark and walked until they found something worth finding. Petra Voss retired 2 years after the accord was signed. Her farewell address was short. She was always short, in every sense of the word. She said she was leaving the HEA in good hands, that there was more space to map than any one lifetime could manage, and that she was looking forward to not attending any more diplomatic sessions for the remainder of her natural life. She sent me a personal message the day she retired. It said, "Tell your Chancellor we'll send that postcard eventually. We've just been busy." I showed it to Chancellor Yuran. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has finally, fully, and completely understood a joke that began 30 years before he heard the punchline. "Verath," he said, "what are they going to find next?" I thought about Tomas Ferreira inside that ancient installation. I thought about 31 ships filing through an impossible passage on the first day, and the 14 that followed, and the hundreds that had followed those. I thought about Dio Okafor's navigation update, 43 systems in 11 hours, and about a survey vessel called the Persistent Margot disappearing into uncharted dark, with cheerful running lights and a promise of a postcard. "I have absolutely no idea," I said, and I meant it as a compliment.